Hi, Bob from Pinegrow here with the second in our series of making pages with CSS Grid in Pinegrow. In this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through making an entire page using Bootstrap 4 and CSS Grid. We'll learn a little bit more about how to use CSS Grid in Pinegrow, as well as some neat tips and tricks for CSS Grid. Let's get started. Remember, CSS Grid is just a set of properties, so we can use it in a plain HTML page or in conjunction with a framework like Bootstrap or Foundation if we want to use additional components that those beep. Remember, CSS Grid is just a set of properties, so we can use it in a plain HTML page or in conjunction with a framework like Bootstrap or Foundation if we want to use additional components found in those frameworks. I'm going to start with a minimal project that I've already created containing some assets and a blank Bootstrap 4 page. You can download it from the link below the tutorial or in the written tutorial to follow along. But of course, feel free to make your own page from scratch or incorporate Grid into an existing project. If you are using the starting template, after downloading and unzipping the project, open the Summer Nights folder as a project by starting Pinegrow and then clicking on the Open Project shortcut. Next, you're going to want to select that newly unzipped folder. So here's my Summer Nights zip download, and I'm going to make this a little smaller. You're going to want to select this folder, click the button, and it will open as a project. Next, you're going to want to open the start.html file by clicking. So I'm just going to show you what the finished product looks like. Here it is, and you can see that it nicely collapses down as we get smaller. Okay, so what does the starting product look like? So that's here. As you can see, I've already set this up with an image that I've brought in, as well as that title, the author, and some text, and really no styling whatsoever. So the first thing that we're going to do is set up our grid for displaying the page contents. There are a number of ways that you can do this. For example, if we planned on a complex page with a number of different grids, we could wrap the existing content in a div element. Since we're setting up a simple page, we'll just add our grid to the page body element. So if we go ahead and select that, we can then open up the Pinegrow grid editor by either typing Control-G or Command-G. It depends on what system that you're on. I'm on a Mac, so I'm going to use Command-G. And that'll bring up this modal. Like most of the dialog boxes for Pinegrow, you can also pop this out if you want to move it over onto a different monitor to kind of keep it out of the way. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to keep it here locked onto this page. Now I'm going to want to go ahead and click this Create CSS Grid button. That'll actually add the display grid rule to the body at the same time that it then splits our page up into various areas. So right now it's set up with a single row that's 100 pixels high and 3 columns, each 1 fraction wide, so 33% of the width. And so our image actually is in this very first area, but it overlaps out into the next row down. Our title is in that next one because it's the next item in the DOM tree. And then our author is in the third one because it's the third item in the DOM tree. The browser has made a second row for the div text. So the div text is in a second row, and actually the browser, if we don't specify when it makes that second one, will give it an automatic height that is large enough to accommodate whatever content goes into that second automatically created row. So at this point, we can use the Pinegrow grid editor to add columns and rows. I'm going to add 2 more columns and 3 rows. So to add columns, we can either add a column before or a column after by hovering above any of these and then clicking. So I'm just going to go ahead and add 2 more. Whoops. And because they're all one fraction, it doesn't matter where I click, particularly at this point, either before or after, and either at one of the middle ones or one of the outside ones. So now you can see our content is spaced into 1, 2, 3, 4 of those areas, corresponding to the image, H1, author, and div, text. And so now we're going to add 3 more rows, and it's just the same. We can either add them before or after the existing ones. Since nothing's really set up yet, we can click either. So 1, 2, 3. So now we have a 5x4 grid. Now if we want, we can start playing around with the sizing. If we want to stick with fractions for our column, we can either use the sliders and just up and down. Or if we want to, we can use the arrows. After we click in there, we can use the arrows to make them bigger and smaller. And remember, if we want to make big jumps, like if we wanted this to be 10 fraction, we can hold down the shift key before we hit that arrow, and each time it would add 10. So let's just take that back down to 1. As you can see, when we were increasing and decreasing the size of that initial fraction, the other fractions were getting smaller. And that's because the browser is now doing math for us and saying, okay, we want the width of the screen divided up into 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 fractions, of which the last 4 each get 1 portion and the first one gets 11. So the math on that's kind of tough, but the browser is doing it for us. Okay, so in addition to being able to use the slider or the up and down arrows with the shift key, if we double click on the size input, we're also going to get a context menu that contains the most common sizes along with description. So just double click here. So we can see we can have a fixed size, we can have a fraction, we have an selection for auto, which will expand the column or row to fit the content size. And then we have a really powerful one, min-max, that basically clamps the size of the column between 2 sizes. So the first being the minimum. So for example, if we chose this one, we wouldn't want our column to go below 100 pixels. And then at maximum, we want it to be 1 whole fraction. So once it goes above a certain size where the 1 fraction is more than 100 pixels, it won't become larger than that. There's also a couple of other here that I'm not going to really explain. The only one that I want to point out here is, if you remember in that first video, we used repeat, and that will basically create multiple columns, 3 to be exact, each of 200 pixels in size. So we can pick that very quickly and change it up. All right. In addition to pixels for fixed size, so if we were to say 100 pixels, we can also choose to use rem or m. And again, when we move that up and down, well, in this case, it's way too big, so we'll just make it a little bit smaller. And we might come back to this a little bit when we look to make this page more responsive. So let's start by placing our image. If you select the image in either the, I'm going to just close this. If you select the image here in the tree panel or on the page view, you can see that right now the image has tabs with A on them. That's because we haven't really placed this anywhere on the grid. The browser has placed it in that first upper left column and row area automatically. And so now we can also see that our image as floating off into this second row, the next row down. And that's because the image is really being constrained by the width here and then expanding to the full height of the image. So the full height of the image is bigger than a single area, so it extends down into the second. So let's change this so we can get more precise placement. We'll start by constraining the height and width to 100% of our grid image. So again, with the image selected, we're going to go to our Styles panel. Then we're going to go to the Dimensions, and we're going to constrain the width and the height. So both 100%. And the problem is now, though, that if you look, because our column is wider than what the image expects, you don't have the correct aspect ratio. So the image looks kind of squished. And so to overcome this, we're going to use another CSS property called Object Fit. And so we'll just scroll down here, and it's within the display area. Object Fit, pull that down, and we'll select Cover. So now what that's going to do is it's going to maintain the image aspect ratio and take up the entirety of whatever section we assign it to. Next, we're going to resize the image to the whole width of the grid and to the first 3 rows simply by dragging the tabs on the right and the bottom of the image. So go ahead and grab this tab. We'll just pull it all the way across. And so now you see, instead of having A's, we now have numbers 1, 1, 6, and 3. And that's reflected over here in our inline style. And now we're going to drag this down to make it 4. So remember, we're going by tracks and not by areas. So even though it covers the first 3 rows, it stretches from the first to the 4th track. All right. And again, grid area 1, 1, 4, 6. So row start, column start, row end, column end. Next, let's go ahead and place the title. We can do this in 2 different ways. We can drag the handles like we did for the image, or we can select the title element and then drag it where we want it while holding down either the Command or the Control keys. So I'm going to go back to the DOM tree, just easier for me. Select that title, and then go over here, begin dragging it, and then just hold down, in this case, because I'm on a Mac, the Command, and we're going to place it right here. Next, we're going to go ahead, so we're placing it in the 3rd over the 2nd down for now. Next, we're going to go ahead and stretch this out so that it takes up just a titch bit more room. So we just drag that over, we'll drag it to there. So that looks pretty good. Next, we're going to go ahead and place the author. So for the author, again, click on it. Hold down the Command, and then let's drag it right to there below the title. And then finally, we have our text. So then we just want to make sure that we're not selecting the individual paragraphs, but we're selecting the entire div.text. And again, you can select it from that breadcrumb. This time, I'm just going to go ahead and stretch these. So we want it to go to, say, here, and then we'll stretch this one in to here. And you can see that right now the content is bigger than that final row, and so that it sticks out of that final row, and that's fine. Okay, so now we kind of have our items placed on the page. With that completed, we can now begin resizing our grid to better fit how we want our content laid out. To accommodate the content, we'll reopen our grid editor if you closed it, which I did. And again, on a Mac, Command-G, on a Windows, Control-G. I believe it's also Command-G on Linux. You can also, I should point this out, you can also click on this button here, the Style Attribute button. That will allow you to do a number of things, including edit the parent grid, which we can see our hotkey right there. So now we've got that opened up. Let's change for right now this back down to, change it down to a fraction. And then we want to accommodate the content. To fit all of our content in, we will change the sizing on this last row to auto. So double click and select auto. We can now see that it has expanded to fit the entire height of that content. We will also do this for the title row, plus make the rows above and below the title a little bit larger and equal in size. So our title right now, if we look, is in this and this area. So we're going to make this one something like 150. So I'm just holding the shift and clicking up. That's jumping me by 2. We'll make this one equal. So 150. We also want to set the title row to be auto to accommodate whatever content is in there. Double click, auto. So now that's starting to look pretty good. Things are shaping up. Best of all, haven't had to deal with floats, haven't had to deal with relative positioning and breaking the whole flow of the page. So now, before proceeding with more grid goodness, let's just do a little bit of styling. First, let's give both the title and the author a different color so that we can see them. So I'm just going to pick the title, go to our styles panel, scroll down to the font section by clicking on this T icon here, and we'll give it a color, I guess, slightly off-white. And then we'll do the same for the author. So we're already at the right area. We'll give it the same color, hash F0, F0, F0. So next, I'm kind of unhappy right now. If I just unselect, I'd like to see this be down closer to the text. So in order to do this, we could do something like add a bunch of margin at the top or padding at the top, something like that. But what we can actually do that's a lot more powerful is within that grid, we can use Flexbox. So now again, with the author selected, we can scroll down to in the styles panel to flex container, flex child section, and then we can use this align self and just align it down to the end. And so now we have the author still within this original grid, but now it's placed on the end. Okay, so now with that aligned, we can go ahead and add another element to the page. Let's go ahead and add a quote. In this case, Bootstrap has a nice component we can use to insert it. We can click on the plus key to open an element insertion modal. Just type plus. We get this to pop up for inserting the element. And then we're going to want to do a block quote, so we can do that in the search. And then we can drag it to the page. In this case, rather than electing to prepend or append it to the page view, we'll hold down the command key, and that way we can select a specific grid location. So just start dragging to the page, hold down the command key, and I'm going to put it in this grid area right here. So now we need some content. I'm going back over here to my project panel. I'm going to pick the content.txt file. If I go ahead and double click on that, it'll pop it up below in my code editor, and we can pick out the quote itself. So I'm just going to highlight that, copy it. And then we could go into text editing mode to change this, but closing this down, we can also go to the properties panel, and we can see that in the properties panel, there is a block for the block quote. Select that, paste, changes that. We can also grab our source, the lovely Mr. Pinecone. Go to our citation. Go ahead and paste that. We don't have to worry about the source title. The source title is just a way we can add a uniquely styled title in along with the citation. So now we have our quote and our author. So right now our quote is in place, but it's placed right up against the side of the page. If we were not using grid, we would want to do something like add some margin to the left side of the quote. We could still obviously do that. However, then if we put more content below this quote, we might have a bit of a hassle trying to make everything line up and remember what size margin we added. And instead with CSS Grid, we can just add another column to the left. So let's go ahead and open up the Pinegrow Grid editor again, click on the style attribute, select edit parent grid, or type on that hotkey. And then this time we're going to add a column before the block quote. So we're going to go to this first column. We're going to the left side. That way it'll add it before it. And you can see that something kind of a little bit unexpected happened. So right now all of the columns shifted over by one, and the column, even though we clicked on that left side, it opened up a new column, leaving it blank on the right. And that's because all of these grid areas so far have been absolutely positioned. And so when we added another grid, this one now became track 7. We said we wanted this place, for example, from 1 to 6, and so that's exactly what happened. So to fix this, one thing that we can do is we can simply drag the tabs of each element to reposition them where we want them. Going forward, I'm going to show you how to use named areas and named tracks, plus another little trick to prevent this from happening. So first, let's do some resizing. So let's go ahead and once again, we'll just drag the tabs. So for this one, we're going to want to move it over by 1. Same with this one. Move our div. I'm going to close this just to get it out of the way. Make sure that we have this one selected. Drag that over by 1, over by 1. And then our quote. Make sure you have the whole block quote picked or selected. Drag it over. So actually this is kind of fun. You can really dynamically change your page layout without having to do a lot of fooling around, adding classes, removing classes, things like that. So let's open our grid editor up again, style attribute, edit parent grid. And for this first column, I'm going to give it a fixed size. Give it 100 pixels. Let's do the same for the last column. Select it there. So now we have just a little bit of easing to each side of our quote and our text. That looks pretty good. Maybe the space between the quote and the text here is a little bit large. And so we can select that. That's going to be this column. So instead of this column being 1 fraction wide, let's make it fixed. And then let's decrease that down. So I'm just holding the shift again, decrease it down. 60 looks pretty good. The other thing that we can do is we can add a gap between each of these columns. So right now each column is flush up against the column before it. We can add sort of like a little bit of margin around. Let's go ahead and let's say like maybe 10 pixels. So that looks pretty good. We could also size the gap if we wanted to. Instead of in pixels, we could size it by EM or REM units. That way it would sort of flow with the size of the text selected for the body or the elements. Hopefully right now you can appreciate how easy it was to get just the layout that we wanted. And it really took very minimal amounts of CSS. So right now if you went through and you looked at the inline styles, you'd find that basically there's about 10 lines of CSS that has defined our entire layout here. And this layout, if you take a look, it kind of resizes nicely. Collapses down, sticks where it's supposed to be compared to the other things. So next up, we're going to learn how we can avoid some of the problems that we had when we added that extra column. We can assign elements to named areas rather than grid coordinates, and that can make placing them on the page a little easier when doing updates to the grid structure. And we'll also see how it's pretty useful for when we make our page responsive. Adding area names is quick and easy with Pinegrow. I'm just going to close this down. To place the title into a named area, all we have to do is make sure that it's selected. So I'm just going to grab it again off of the tree. It's easier for me. And now with that selected, we go to the style attribute, click on it, and we say set named area. And that'll bring up this new dialog box, and we can give it any name we want. So we'll just call it title. Now if we open that grid back up, what we can see is now those two areas within the grid that the title takes up have the name title. And then we can go ahead and do this with the rest of our items. I should just show you really quickly. By doing this, if we look at our styling for the title, now rather than having a grid area of 4, 2, 6, 3, it now has a grid area of title. So let's go ahead and do that for some of the other elements. Easiest way is just to, again, to select them, click on the style attribute. In this case, if we wanted to also put this as an area of title, we could select this, but we're going to give it a new one. We're going to say author. And then we can make sure we select this one, the whole thing, set named area. And our final one, make sure the whole thing's selected. So now that area is named grid area text. If we reopen the grid editor, we can see now that we have our title area named, our author area, our text, and our quote. Okay, so now that we've got our main areas laid out, there's one other thing that I want to point out about grid. So right now, the way we've been treating grid, and that's partially because of the already set up nature of this starting page, is we've been treating each of these grid cells as almost like a div. And so far that's looked just fine. That's because we had this text already placed into a div. But we should be clear that the areas on a grid, even though we have them named and they look like they're discrete containers, they're not. You actually have to put something within the container to make the code inside flow correctly. And I'll just show you what I mean by that. So, for example, if we wanted to put something above this saying like inspiration, so we can just take and grab, I don't know, maybe an H3. We'll drag it over here. We'll put it right above the, right below the block quote. It's not going to style correctly because of the grid, so we'll just grab it and drag it with the command held down. And it's going to be put right into there. Now, if we'll just select over here, we can see that it's overlapping. And that's kind of a little weird thing, but it's because these aren't actually discrete elements according to the grid. The grid just knows that it has to put everything within that grid named, that either named or outlined grid area within that same grid. And so what we would have to actually do is go ahead and bring in some kind of container. So if we just look for a div, bring that div into the same container, and then we'll go ahead and rearrange things. So we'll bring this div up here. And now you can see everything is flowing correctly within that block. This brings up an important topic, and that's that you can't overlap named areas. So we couldn't, for instance, put that author block into the title block. It would end up going over the top of this title. So you need to either have a div to help organize things, or there's another way that you can do this. There's another way that you can use names to better place things, to more easily place things, and still have overlap. So I'm just going to get rid of this really quickly. Bring that block quote back out. And get rid of that div. Whoops. Okay. So let's open up the grid editor again. Select on the body, grid. Right now, we have our top image here. If we just pull that up, we have the top image set by absolute area. So we have it as a grid area of 1, 1, 4, 7. We can't name this because then we can't have an overlap with the title. So instead, what we can do is name the tracks. And to do that in Pinegrow, all you have to do is hover over the track, then you click, and then you give it a name. One thing that you'll notice here in this pop-up is that it indicates that if you want to use something as a name track to start or end something, you need to add a dash start or a dash end. So for example, for this track, we want it to be the start of our header image. So we can put, and now we have that named. And then we want it to end here. And the last one is here, just below the author. Now we could have chosen to give this one and the 2 start tracks and the 2 end tracks different names. So we could have said header top start, header side start, header side end, header bottom end, or something like that, but we don't have to. The other thing to point out is now when we export this, when we actually send it out to CSS, the hyphenated portion of that will actually, the start or the end will actually be removed. That's just for the purposes of Pinegrow. So if we close this down again, you can see that our grid area is still 1147. To get it to convert over, we just grab one of the tabs, pull it down, let it spring back, and now you can see that the grid area is now header. And it's located, the name is on all the tabs. Just like for here, the area name is author, the area name is title. So now we have everything placed onto our grid with names. So we have our areas named for most of the elements. We also have our image now placed on there with the header tags. I just wanted to show you as an aside one other way that you can get something to stay full width, and that's by taking advantage of the fact that in addition to each of the tracks having a positive number, so positive 1, 2, 3, so on, they also have negative numbers. So this track over here is actually -1, then you've got -2, -3, so on and so forth. This is actually true for the rows as well. This is going to be -1, -2, -3, 4, 5. So what we can do if we want something to remain full width is, and we don't want to use named tracks, we can go back to that grid area, scroll down here, and we can give it numbers. And then we just have to give it the row start, the column start, the row end, and the column end. So in this case, we want it to start at 1 and 1. So the top and the leftmost side. Then for a row, we want it to end at 4. Remember, we're not naming the areas, we're naming or numbering the areas, we're numbering the tracks. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And then to make it always stick to that right side, you can use -1. Now we can see that we are full size again. And in this case, because it's -1, even if we delete or add a column in here, it'll still stay tagged to this right side. Okay, let's start putting the rest of our page together by adding our site logo and some navigation. Just click on the style attribute, add the parent grid. That'll bring this up. So what we're going to do is add another row above the first one. So click that on. We can see because I changed this back to a grid area that it didn't auto snap. So we're just going to put this as header. And now you can see it snaps down to that lower area. We have to do that to refresh the tabs. So to insert a logo, we can either click on the plus sign on our keyboard to pop up this insert element. We're just going to use a little bit of pug to put in the logo. So I'm going to say, so that's just saying in pug to put in a link with a class of logo, and then within that link. And now we have that pug down here. We can just drag it to the page. I'm going to hold down the command and put it over in that left-hand most grid area. Okay, and so now for the navigation, we will drag and drop a bootstrap nav bar to the page. Remember, as I said, CSS Grid is just a set of CSS properties, and it plays really well with pretty much any framework. So you can mix and match, take components, and Bootstrap has some really great nav bars. So to get those, we're going to go over to our library panel here, click on components. Then when this comes up, we're just going to navigate down to the nav bars. And I guess we can just grab like the very top one. We're going to drag it over and then hold down the command so that we can place it in that rightmost grid area. So now we have this, this nav bar. And one of the things that you can see immediately is that we've now added a whole bunch of area over here to the side. And that's because this nav bar overflowed this particular grid area. And so the browser automatically added all this extra on here. And so we can go ahead and clean that up a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just stretch this over. Let's stretch it over to like, let's stretch it one more. Did that cure it? That did cure it. And we're also going to get rid of some of this that we don't need. So we don't need that nav bar there. We also don't need the disabled or the search. So this one's a little bit more complicated than what we needed. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that nav bar brand. I'm going to leave the toggler. That's what gives us our hamburger when it collapses down. And I'm also going to get rid of the disabled nav bar item. And then finally, I'm going to get rid of this whole form here at the end. So just delete that down. So now our links are significantly shortened down to just a single link plus a drop down. We can go ahead and give those different names if we want to. Just edit them like we normally would in Pinegrow. And then we can be done with the editing of that. All right, let's try neatening our navigation up a little bit now. So I want to put these over to the right side here, and we're going to use Flexbox to do that. If we take a look at a smaller screen, so remember that with Bootstrap, when you degrade down to a smaller screen size, it converts over to this hamburger menu. So we want both the list here and the hamburger to align to the right. And so to do this, we're going to pick this main nav bar element. We're going to go to the styles. And then if we're not already there, we're going to scroll down to the flex container by clicking here and then justify that content to the end. Now you can see already that the hamburger has moved over to the right, but the list has not. So this is always something that you have to think about when you're working with a framework and you're trying to sort of force it to look the way you want to. You have to remember that the designers have put some rules in place to make it look a certain way. So let's take a look at why maybe this isn't aligning over. If we go back to our tree, and we look, this is the container for the menu when it's not collapsed. And you can see on the very first item within that, the list that contains each of those three items, there's a class of mr-auto. And what that's going to do is it's going to put a margin here to the right that fills up this space. So even though it doesn't look like it's moved to the end, it actually has when you take into account this margin here at the right. So to overcome that, what we can do is either put our own class on or just go into our properties panel and just remove that MR Auto. And now we can see that our menu is nicely justified to the end in both small sizes and large sizes. So we're just going to get rid of this now. Go back to this one. The other thing that I hope you can see is that this section here is a slightly different color than the rest. Again, this is something that the framework designers have done to change the look of things. So if we go ahead and select that and we look along here, we can see that it actually probably comes from this class here. We can turn that off. Try that one. Yes. So removing those two classes got rid of our problem with this having a slightly different color than the other. With that completed, we can now go into the grid and set the names for the logo and navigation areas. Actually, let's make this a little bit bigger first. We'll stretch this over to here. Now we'll go ahead, click on that, and we'll look at the parent grid. So now we're going to set that as a named area. Looks nice there as far as named areas. Right now, it looks to me like the top row is a little bit. Let's go ahead and make that a little bit smaller. So we'll just go ahead and click on that and then hold the shift and hit the down arrow 5 times. 100 looks pretty good. Navigation is already centered vertically in the area by Flexbox styling and Bootstrap. Let's do the same with the logo. In this case, because the logo is not contained within any kind of outer div, we can't actually use the Flexbox justify content property because that's for justifying content within an outer. Instead, we have to use align self. So going back up here. So align self is located both in this flex child area, and we would use align self center to move it down. It's also located in our grid and right here. So those are both really equivalent. You can use either one, whichever you feel like. Okay, so while the page doesn't look too bad, let's give it a little TLC. For the logo, let's go ahead and change the font. So we're going to go up here, change the font family to one that I've already got loaded in from Google Fonts, Lotto. Let's also increase the font size. I'm going to use M's here. So call it 2.2. That's starting to look kind of nice. We'll transform it uppercase. We'll give it a slightly off-white color. And I guess in this case, we actually will give it a little bit of margin. Let's give it like 20 pixels worth of margin to that left just to get it off of the edge. We could add in another row, but here maybe it's a little bit of overkill. For styling the navigation, let's actually create a CSS rule targeting the navigation links. So we're going to go to our tree. We're going to pick one of the nav bar items, so one of those links. Then go ahead to our styles panel, click on the ellipsis button. So that's going to give us some nice specificity there, but not over specified with the two classes. Hit the create. Then we're going to change the font once again. So we'll go ahead and select that Lotto. Give it sort of a gray color. Let's now style the hover state. So there's a couple of different ways we can do this, but probably the easiest way is just with it still selected. Go ahead and click the ellipse, click those same two, and then this time click the colon at the end and select hover. Click create. We can see that now if we hover over there. And then finally, let's change the active state. We'll style the active state. Just go up to the ellipse, nav bar nav, nav link, click the colon again, click on the active pseudo state. And then to see that, we can just go ahead and click on the active here, and you can see it turns a nice color that's a little bit darker than our hover color. Okay, so looking pretty good. So maybe we can change the overall page font now to give it a little bit more pizzazz. I'm just going to close this out and go back up and select the body element. Go back to our styles, go to the text section. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and instead of selecting one of these that I've loaded in from Google Fonts, I'm going to use a built-in font. I'm going to use Georgia. You can see it changes the fonts around pretty nicely. We want to make sure that the title breaks correctly. So we're just going to go into text editing, go right after the title, and hit a shift return. That up one, that'll put a break in. So we always make sure that we break in the same place. Then with the title still selected, we're going to go into our font family. This time we're going to change it to one of the ones that I loaded in, Abril Fat Face. And then we're going to increase our font size to 4EM. That's not looking too bad, but seems maybe a little bit narrow. So let's go back into the grid editor. So I'm going to click on the style attribute, go down to edit parent grid. This time I think I'm going to add the quote into maybe a slightly larger one, maybe 2. Let's just move this up and out of the way. And then let's move the majority of the content here to something like maybe 7. So that's looking pretty nice. We've got a good spacer, 60 pic spacer in between. That's pretty decent. We could fool around with this a little bit more. So this is the magic of both CSS Grid and being able to edit visually in Pinegrow. You can fool around with the spacing until you get it just how you like it. Let's see, one last thing for the styling. Let's add a little bit of decoration to the page. It's looking just a bit plain. So I'm going to close this down for right now. I'm going to click plus on my keyboard to pop up the insert element. I'm going to use Pug once again, so I can just clear it out there. And this time I'm going to add a paragraph. And then within that paragraph, I'm just going to add a large ampersand. And then we're going to drag that box right down and place it in the second grid column on top of the logo. So we're going to take that, again, hold the command, we're going to put it right there. So now it's kind of hard to see. I'll just deselect over here. We'll get rid of this. Deselect. You can see the and is right there. And so what we can do is go ahead, make sure it's still selected, and then take these tabs and let's stretch it over to the 5th. So here, and then down to the 4th row. So down there, you can see none of our content is disturbed. They are either in named areas. Putting extra content in those boxes doesn't disturb them. Now we're going to style that. Go back up here to the visual editor. Go to the font. We're going to increase the font size to 30 EM. So that's making it pretty large. You can see that it already bopped things out a bit. Change the line height to 1. We're also going to change the color. So make it slightly transparent. Right now we're getting a little bit more overlap than I would like with the title. We can change this in a couple of ways. So we could alter the Z index of our ampersand here to put it below the title. But this is also kind of a good opportunity to learn a couple things about Grid. So one of the things that you might picked up on in looking at the DOM tree so far is that really the DOM tree has no relationship whatsoever to what's over on the page. And while this is a neat feature of Grid that your DOM tree doesn't have to match the page and can be useful when you're degrading down for different page sizes, it's really a bad idea for accessibility. So I'm going to close this down. So we really want to neaten this tree up now to look more like the actual DOM structure. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take this logo and this nav bar, and I'm going to move them back up here. You can see nothing on the page changed. Now we have the image below. That's pretty good. Next, let's go ahead and move this this title and author up. We want those to be above our page text. And for that matter, I think we'll also move the block quote up just before that page text. So now if someone was to come in with a screen reader, they would follow through our page layout a lot better. So we still have this issue text here being overlapped by that decoration, by the and that's because the browser is quite rightfully placing content on the page in the order it was put up here. This comes after our H1 title, and so the browser is putting it on top. So instead of altering the Z index, what we can do is we can just move that up to right after that. And I just realized that the title and the author are out of order, so I'm just going to move that down. So you can see we completely rearranged the DOM tree without having any impact on how the content was displayed. And that's because we're in named areas and Grid doesn't care what order it is in the DOM tree. The only other problem we have is, and I don't know if this is readily apparent, but the decoration has made the spacing below the title a little large since this row is set to auto. So if we one way we can overcome this is by changing sizes, but another way that we can overcome this is actually by giving that decoration a little bit more room to expand. So we can bring this down one more row, and now we can see that the spacing above the title and the spacing below the title is equal. Again, it's a great thing to be able to fool around with visually in Pinegrow. So we can see things like this happen. We can see content unexpectedly changing sizes, but we can visually adjust. So for right now, that's all I'm going to do with this page as far as main styling. The next thing that's up is to make it responsive. So right now, as it stands, if we resize the page, we see that it collapses down kind of nicely. But we can already see there's a problem with the navigation a little bit, and there's a problem with just generally the page looking maybe a little bit crowded and this ampersand impinging. So in the next video, we'll tackle that.